Welcome to Whiskey Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 833 for August 23rd, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
It's tough times, but out of adversity comes innovation, and I'm hoping we'll be able to kind of relaunch in 2021 as and when regulations allow.
This time of year, tourists would normally be filling the grounds of Ireland's Slane Castle, not just for the annual Slane concert, but to visit the Slane Distillery. Of course, 2020 is anything but a normal year. It's been almost 3 years now since Brown-Forman and the Conyngham family started making whiskey on the grounds of Slane Castle, and we'll check in with Alex Conyngham later on Whiskey Cast in Depth. That's just ahead, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, and
what we like to do with our finishing casks is we like to select something that complements the whiskey rather than mask it. Obviously, we don't want to take away from the wonderful flavours that are already present in Deanston.
The news is next on this episode of Whiskey Cast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of Whiskey Cast.
Let's get started with the news. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a disaster in many, many ways, but for our purposes, we'll focus on the impact of the pandemic on small-scale distillers in the U.S. A new report from the Distilled Spirits Council and the American Distilling Institute estimates lost sales to small-scale distillers at 41%, worth more than $700 million. Most of that came from distilleries having to close down their tasting rooms and on-site stores during public health lockdowns since March. Nearly a third of distillery workers have been laid off, with the number estimated at 4,600 people nationwide. The closings of bars and restaurants in many states also wiped out on-premise sales, with 11% of craft distillers reporting that their entire wholesale business has disappeared, making them completely reliant on what they can sell to consumers themselves. There's just 4 months left before the one-year extension of the federal excise tax break for small-scale distillers expires at the end of the year. Meanwhile, we had more whiskey events canceled or postponed because of the pandemic this week. Whiskies of the World has now decided to pull the plug on all of its remaining live events in the U.S. for the rest of the year, including events in Houston, Dallas, Austin, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. All of those events are being postponed until 2021, with tickets that had been sold for this year's events to be honored next year. In Scotland, Royal Mile Whiskies has decided now to cancel plans for its Whiskey Fringe event in Edinburgh. That event had originally been scheduled for earlier this month, but there were tentative plans to try in late October. Those plans have now been dropped, and all ticket holders will receive a full refund. The International Whiskey Festival, also known as Whiskey Live Holland, this November in the Netherlands has been canceled, and the Stockholm Beer and Whiskey Festival in Sweden has now been moved to a single weekend at the end of November instead of its usual run over the last weekend of September and the first weekend of October. Whiskey Advocate has now decided to postpone its Big Smoke Meets Whiskey Fest show in Miami until next April. One event that is still going forward for now, but on a scaled-back level, the Victoria Whiskey Festival this January in Victoria, British Columbia. Organizers announced this week that the number of master classes and tastings will be reduced so that they can all be held in the Hotel Grand Pacific's 2 main ballrooms instead of using 4 or 5 smaller meeting rooms at a time. There will also be strict limits on attendance in line with provincial health regulations. There's been a small sign of progress in trade talks between the U.S. and the European Union. The two sides agreed to cut import tariffs on around $200 million worth of products this week, but whiskies were not part of the list. Europe is removing its tariffs on imports of lobsters from the U.S., while the U.S. will reduce its tariffs on imports of glassware, ceramics, and other European goods. I know, no big deal, right? Well, actually, it's important because the Trump administration has been threatening to raise tariffs on other European imports unless the EU removed its tariff on U.S. lobsters. Exports of U.S. lobsters to Europe have dropped since the EU reached a new trade deal with Canada that eliminated the tariffs on Canadian lobsters. The deal is being seen by observers on both sides as a positive sign that the two sides may be able to resolve some of their differences that led to whiskey tariffs on both sides of the Atlantic. And as for how one can tell the difference between a U.S. lobster and a Canadian lobster, well, the Canadian lobsters are less likely to use their claws on you. They're that polite. In other news, Ardbeg has named the successor to retiring distillery manager Mickey Heads, and they didn't have to look very far, just down the road. Lagavulin manager Colin Gordon is leaving Diageo to take over at Ardbeg starting October 1st. He previously managed the Port Ellen maltings for Diageo before moving to Lagavulin 2 years ago. Let's talk about new whiskies now. Distell unveiled 8 new whiskies from Bunnahabhain, Tobermory, and Deanston in its 2020 set of limited edition single malts. The range includes 2 Bunnahabhains, a 1997 Pedro Jimenez finish, and a 2008 Manzanilla cask matured, 3 from Deanston, including a 2002 Pinot Noir cask finish, and 3 from Tobermory, with 2 peated single malts under the Lechig label, and a 2007 port pipe finish Tobermory. It's the first set of limited edition releases for Distell Master Blender Julianne Fernandez after she took on the role earlier this year. She and her colleagues were on a Zoom call with whiskey writers this week.
Obviously, now that I'm in this role, I look after all of our whiskies, our Deanston, Tobermory, Bunnahabhain, and as I kind of touched on earlier, Deanston for me it's a lighter spirit. It lends itself better to different cask finishes, and for me, it's just a little bit more expressive. So you will start seeing some really different finishes coming through from Deanston. I've just laid down some different maturations as well, but obviously it'll be a good few years before we see them. Bunnahabhain is a little bit more traditional, so we know that wine finishes and sherry finishes tend to work really well with it. But yeah, so these ones are mine. Everything going forward will be. So I hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope that you like the ones that I'm laying down going forward.
All 8 releases will be available in Europe, with other regions receiving between 3 and 7 of the whiskies. Recommended retail prices range from around £100 to £350 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for a couple of them later on. Also in Scotland, Glendronach is releasing a new single malt that's tied in with the latest movie in the Kingsman series that comes out later this fall. The Kingsman edition 1989 vintage was inspired by what is said to be the oldest bottle of whiskey at the distillery, a 29-year-old single malt bottled back in 1913. It was one of 3 purchased by 3 friends before they went off to fight in World War I. They intended to drink them together after the war, but one of the 3 died in combat. His family later gave the bottle back to the distillery, where it remains to this day. 3,052 bottles of the Kingsman Edition 1989 vintage will be available in select markets starting next week, with a recommended retail price of around $1,300 each. Greg and Kirsty Dillon of the Scottish independent bottler Great Drams have 3 new releases out, a 30-year-old Girvan single grain, along with an 8-year-old Knockdhu port cask and a 9-year-old cask from Blair Athol. They'll be available at whiskey specialist shops. No word on pricing. In the U.S., we got a hint about this year's Little Book release from Beam Suntory a few weeks ago from Fred No, but the full story came out this week. Freddie No's Chapter 4 edition of Little Book is named Lessons Honored, And the blend includes a 4-year-old bourbon that uses brown rice as the flavoring grain, along with an 8-year-old rye and a 7-year-old bourbon. Little Book Chapter 4 will sell for around $125 a bottle. From England now, the Lakes Distillery has unveiled the next release in its Whiskey Makers Edition series of single malts, created by Davil Gandhi. The Colheita edition was matured in Colheita port casks from Portugal and a few ex-bourbon barrels. It'll go on sale next week with a recommended retail price of £65 a bottle in the UK. And now that South Africa's government has decided to relax its latest temporary ban on alcohol sales and production, Distell's James Sedgwick Distillery can release its new 2007 vintage edition of 10-year-old Three Ships single malt. It's the third release in the Three Ships vintage series, and it'll only be available in South Africa for now. In other news from the Crime and Punishment Department, with the sentencing Friday of actress Lori Loughlin and fashion designer Massimo Giannulli in the college admissions scandal, only a handful of cases remain to be resolved, including one that involves the whiskey industry. Marcy Palatella is scheduled to go to trial in January on federal conspiracy charges following her indictment last year. She and her husband own Preservation Distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky, and she has consistently maintained her innocence since the indictments were unsealed. Prosecutors accused Palatella of paying $75,000 to have another suspect correct their son's SAT scores, and another $500,000 in bribes to get him admitted to USC as a football recruit. The outcome of the case could have an impact on Preservation Distillery, along with a wine and spirits distribution company the Palatellas own in California. While the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau only takes action against federal alcohol licenses if a licensee is convicted of an alcohol-related offense, Kentucky state law allows regulators to revoke licenses for any felony conviction, while California state regulators can seek to suspend or revoke a license following conviction of a crime of moral turpitude. A spokesman for California's Alcoholic Beverage Control Board has confirmed that a bribery conviction would qualify under that standard. Also in the courts, the Idaho trial of Secret Spirits founders Jonathan and Cindy Bray on charges of illegally selling alcohol without a license and criminal conspiracy has been postponed once again. It was scheduled to have started this month in Coeur d'Alene, but with the border between the U.S. and Canada still closed because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the trial has been delayed until at least October. The Brays were released on their own recognizance back in March and allowed to return home to Calgary, Alberta, until the trial. The court's docket shows the next court date as a status conference on October 14th. Both of the Brays have pleaded not guilty and maintain that their sales to an undercover state liquor agent were legal. They have also declined all interview requests until after the trial. And we have one more case to mention from the police blotter. Back in February, the Bacon and Bourbon Festival in Charleston, South Carolina, was postponed until July. The announcement came the day of the event, after state regulators rejected the event's special liquor license application the previous day. Now, one of the event planners for Bacon and Bourbon has been charged with a single count of forgery in connection with the application for that license. Our friend Hannah Raskin of the Post and Courier newspaper in Charleston reports that Connie Bowles of Gosnell & Company has been arrested and accused of forging the application to make it look as though the local police chief had signed off on it. Bowles faces up to 3 years in prison if convicted. The company's owner declined to comment on the arrest. And, by the way, the rescheduled July 18th event was also scrapped, this time because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are plans to try again next February, assuming, of course, that the promoters can get a liquor license. Finally, we mentioned this last year, but the Ronald McDonald Charities of Kentuckiana in the Louisville area has started selling tickets for its annual Pappy Van Winkle raffle. The winner will receive a complete set of 10, 12, 15, 20, and 23-year-old Van Winkle whiskies. Tickets are $100 each. The winner will be selected October 15th. There's more information available at pappyraffle.org, and we'll post that link in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com, which is where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. I've already mentioned the events that have been canceled or postponed, so let's focus on what remains on the schedule for now. Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky wraps up its month of Way Back Wednesday tastings this Wednesday night. And New York City's Fine and Rare will have another outdoor whiskey tasting on September 1st. Waterford Distillery's first ever open day is set for September 5th in Waterford, Ireland. Whiskey and Barrel Night is September 16th in Paramus, New Jersey, just outside of New York City. Tales of the Cocktail will be holding its virtual conference online September 21st through the 24th. McTeers has its next whiskey auction on the 25th in Glasgow, Scotland. And Whiskey Live Canberra is on tap for September 25th and 26th in Australia's capital city. Of course, all of these events are subject to change at the last minute, depending on local public health restrictions. So, please make sure you double-check before you make any travel plans. We are updating the calendar of events at whiskycast.com as we get details on changes, along with adding new events for next year. Let's hope we can all get together in person again soon. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of Virginia's most awarded spirits. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online, too. Visit the Where to Buy page at catoctincreekdistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlach. It's been almost 3 years since Brown-Forman and the Conyngham family fired up the stills at Ireland's Slane Distillery on the grounds of the Conyngham family's Slane Castle estate, 45 miles outside of Dublin, right around the time they launched the Slane Irish Whiskey brand using sourced whiskey from other distilleries in Ireland. It's the family's second attempt at developing an Irish whiskey brand, and has been much more successful than the original Slane Castle whiskey brand, largely because of the decision to turn some old buildings on the estate into a distillery. That's where Alex Conyngham has been based during the COVID-19 lockdowns of 2020, and it's where I caught up with him this week on a slightly noisy web connection.
Right now, it's a little tough, as it is for anyone who is, as it were, in the hospitality industry, which we are. I like to say my family, the Conynghams, have been in the entertainment business since 1700s, because Slane Castle, which is a family home, that's what it was built for. It was built as a home, but also as a place to entertain. And in more recent times, we have a fully fledged bar and restaurant. We're employing a lot of local people. We relied heavily on live music for our big rock concerts every year, and all of that is just not possible at the moment. So it's tough times, but out of adversity comes innovation, and I'm hoping we'll be able to kind of relaunch in 2021 as and when regulations allow.
So you're not accepting visitors right now at the distillery, right?
We're not able to right now. We are hoping if things open up in the next short while, we hope that we will be able to welcome some visitors back to the distillery. We're taking people into the castle on a kind of socially distant model, so we can do tours of the castle, and we're going to be launching a combination tour with the distillery, which will have a little more emphasis on the outside than the inside in order to, but we've got wonderful buildings here. We've got views over the concert site. So there's a lot of great stories to weave the music and the whiskey and the family together. So we're hoping that'll be opening up in the next few weeks. Fingers crossed.
I assume your staff has all been healthy and everybody's getting through this okay?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Everyone's doing okay. They're all holding up well. You know, we keep in touch with the team. A lot of them had to move at working at home. Those we were able to keep on. And I guess I'm very lucky in that respect, in that my home is the whole place. So I can move around between the castle and the distillery and the farm. But no, the community spirit in Slane is very strong, and we'll get through this together. Everyone's just looking forward to being able to welcome people back again.
We've seen a lot of issues with whiskey sales going on for the entire industry all over the world. How have you guys been affected, both in terms of the domestic market within Ireland and the export markets like the U.S.? How are you guys doing?
So in Ireland, we're actually doing pretty well. It's been tough. You know, when you're a smaller brand or a kind of a relatively new brand, the on-trade is immensely important, because that's where you build your connection, it's where you build your awareness, and ultimately where you drive trial. And trial is how you build a following. So losing that's been really tough. I would say in Ireland, we've had a lot of successes. We won the gold medal in the Irish Whiskey Awards in the blended category twice. So Slane's already got a nice foothold in Ireland and a good following. So our sales have grown pretty steadily, but I think, easier probably in the home market. In markets like the US, the on-trade is very important for brand building and awareness and trial, as I said. So it's definitely hurt us. But, again, Slane does have a good loyal following. So we haven't dropped off a cliff by any chance, by any kind of standard, but it's going to be hard to, we're looking forward to being able to get back out there again. I just did my first visits there last week out in the Irish trade, getting back out into on-premise accounts and doing a little bit of education. And it felt so good to be able to walk in, on a safe basis and be able to talk whiskey again with people who are into it. So, we're slowly coming out, and fingers crossed that continues.
Well, let's talk about whiskey now, because the last time we had you on the show was back in the spring of 2017 when construction was still going on. You now have a fully fledged distillery and are laying down stocks, right? Yes, we do.
In some ways it seems like many years ago, I guess, because there's just so much that has happened since then. And the construction was complex but hugely exciting. For me, I was a kid, so I'm sitting, my office, which I'm in now, is within the distillery itself. And I look out the window here, and the buildings that I see were kind of tumbling down as a kid. And I had adventures with my brothers and sisters running around. And now, they are fully restored. They've been brought back to life, and we're taking barley from the farm that grows around the distillery. We're turning it into whiskey and making the magic happen. And it's been an extraordinary journey. It really has. And, although we're not welcoming visitors, we are very much still in production. Slane's quite an unusual distillery because we make 3 totally different types of whiskey in the one distillery. So if you cross the water to Scotland, you're typically going to see a malt distillery or maybe a grain distillery, but malt would be more common, where they make one type of whiskey and then they'll put that into lots of different wood. We actually make 3 totally different types of whiskey. So we make a triple distilled malt whiskey from 100% malted barley. We've got 3 beautiful pot stills, which are now up and running. Those babies are kind of works of art, and they were hand-beaten copper made in Scotland. Each one has a different shape, and they are now producing beautiful new make malt whiskey. So the second type of whiskey we make is something called pot still. So it's native to Ireland. You don't get it anywhere else. And it uses malted barley and unmalted barley in the mash bill, which leads to a lovely, creamy, kind of creamier mouthfeel, a little bit of lovely natural spice notes as well. And so we're laying that down too. So that's the two types. And then we've got 6 column stills, and we're making grain whiskey in those. And again, that's a completely different animal. And we are making grain whiskey like no one else because we are using a mash bill, which is entirely barley, a mixture of malt and unmalted. And that new make is really interesting, complex liquid, and is going to make some great single grain whiskey. And then, of course, we can blend any of those together to create blends. So there's a whole plethora of stuff coming down the track, and our warehouse is smelling beautiful. The future looks bright. So, yeah, we're very excited.
When might we start to see some of this whiskey in a bottle? Because I know you've got to wait at least 3 years, and we're getting to that point now where it's just about 3 years for some of your oldest stuff. When will you start incorporating that into the Slane whiskey that we see in a bottle now?
Well, great question. And I guess I'll go on both myself and Brown-Forman, who underpin the project. We're very clear that we will only release something when we feel it's ready. So although the rules are 3 years, if it's not ready, it's not going to do 3 years on the dot. It may need a little longer. Typically, the grain whiskey is probably going to come right quickest. That'll be followed by the malt, and then finally the pot still. So we would hope to be able to start blending some of the malt, for example, into the Slane blend, within the next, you're right, we're coming up to 3 years, only a couple of months away. So I would hope certainly within the next year, some of that malt will start making its way into the blend, but it'll very much be, ready when it's ready. As a standalone product, as in made entirely at Slane, and that may take a little bit longer, but I was only tasting some of the stock there last week, and it's coming together very nicely. But, I'd rather leave it longer and have it better than get it out for the sake of getting it out there.
Since the deal with Brown-Forman, you've had just one Slane Irish Whiskey release. And if I remember correctly, when we were talking back in 2017, there were plans to do a little bit of innovation and maybe release a couple of other things along the lines of some cask finishes or some different varieties. When might we start seeing some of those hit the market?
We are going to see, I can't talk about exactly what it is, but we are definitely going to be doing something within the next 12 to 18 months. You're going to see something new come out of Slane. And, a lot of the feedback, which has been really positive on the blend, has been delving into, for example, the 3 different casks that we use. Because we use virgin American oak, we use a seasoned Tennessee whiskey barrel, and then lastly an Oloroso cask. And we've actually started doing deconstructed tastings at the distillery and on a limited basis with people out in the trade. And this is where you delve into the components separately, because they are 3 very different whiskeys from a stylistic point of view, because those woods, 3 different woods, all bring different things to the table. And off the back of that, we've been getting a lot of encouragement and an interest to maybe play around with those 3 woods a little and perhaps tweak things. And that's probably about as much as I'm allowed to say. So, watch this space. But I think, the important thing was because we stayed out of the market deliberately for 2 years, we started distilling in Slane in 2017. But we originally bought some liquid from other distilleries back in 2015, and that was malt whiskey and grain whiskey that was already technically whiskey, as in it was in cask, but it was all in American cask, like much of Irish has been matured. And rather than just blending that together and putting it in a pretty bottle and getting it out to market, what we actually did is we spent 2 years doing the triple cask process. And there was a cost to that, but I feel very strongly it was the right thing to do because we wanted to put our own stamp and style on the whiskey. And for me, Irish blends are accessible, smooth, easy drinking. We wanted to deliver on that, but bring more complexity and a fuller flavor to the party. And the way to do that was by investing more time in using, in this case, 3 different barrels at the same time.
Are you able to source whiskey? Is there enough whiskey available in the market that you're able to get your hands on mature whiskey, or did you start out with enough to get you through this 2 to 3 year period?
No, we're ambitious about hopefully where this brand is going to go. So we made sure we acquired, enough to keep us going, bearing in mind, as we were talking earlier, different whiskeys take a different amount of time to mature, and it's not an exact science as to when that whiskey is going to be ready. So we got to make sure that we've got enough whiskey to cover us as our own, are not only kind of ready on a date basis, but on a quality basis. So it's also the case that some of the malt whiskey that we originally purchased had a decent amount of age on it. So we've actually got to make sure we hold some of that back. And we're also going to have to let some of our own stuff that we've distilled go a bit longer in terms of time. So I can tell you now, the guys, Garode, Cahill, and Alan Buckley, and the others on our production team who are immensely talented, their inventory control and, vision for shaping how we control our inventory going forward is an amazing skill in of itself.
Will you start making a big deal of it when you're blending your own whiskey from the distillery into the bottles?
Yeah, I think, that would be a lovely moment to see for sure, because I think that marks, another step on our journey. So we'll certainly tell people when that's happening for sure. Absolutely. I think it's really important to stay transparent in whiskey, let people know what you're doing. And we've never shied away from the fact that we source whiskey from others to get ourselves started. But as I say, by putting our own stamp on it through doing the triple casking, I feel that we did at least make it our own. And you need to be honest. I mean, whiskey is about enjoying the drink, but it's also about the stories that go with it. And there are so many wonderful stories in whiskey that I don't think you need to make ones up on top of that. It's important to stay true.
And the reason I asked about sourcing was because I know that before you did the partnership with Brown-Forman, there were some issues when the previous supplier, shall we say, for your original Slane whiskey was acquired by another company, and they decided to get out of the supply business. And there were some issues with that. So I'm just curious how the market has been for getting your hands on sourced whiskey, given the fact that there still aren't that many distilleries with aged whiskey in Ireland.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, so we originally had Slane Castle whiskey, which was also sourced from another distillery, in this case, one particular distillery. And then that distillery got acquired, and then they decided to no longer supplying us. So at that stage, it was like either throw in the towel or do what I had wanted to do. And myself and Dad decided to bite the bullet and look to build our own distillery, because it was really the only way to stay in the game and also to have credibility and control in the long term. But, it was a big shock at the time, but actually it forced our hand, and I wouldn't be sitting where I am now if that hadn't happened. So I'm always an optimist. So out of a bad situation comes good. But in terms of sourcing liquid, you're right, there aren't that many operators who have mature liquid. The market is obviously opening up now because quite a few more and more distilleries are hitting that 3-year benchmark. And so the supply is opening up and getting broader all the time. We're up to just over, I think we've just gone over the 30 distillery mark now in Ireland. So such an exciting time for the category. And, we all generally try to be supportive of each other. The Irish Whiskey Association has a great mentorship scheme where we try and provide support and guidance for new entrants, keep the quality high, and kind of work together on protecting the standard and maintaining quality.
And that's where I was about to go with this, because since you started up in 2015 with the original project here, Irish whiskey, the entire industry has just boomed. It was still only really a handful of distilleries when you guys got started, and as you say, more than 30 now. Is there still room for more growth within Irish whiskey?
Well, you got to bear in mind, back in the heyday, back in the 19th century, there were many more distilleries than that. Now some of them would have been pretty small, but out of those 30 now, they would vary in size, and some of them are just making one type of whiskey. Some would be more ambitious and larger scale. So I think there is scope, for further growth. And it's going to be intriguing to see how the Irish category evolves now, because in Scotland, for example, you've got regionality, which is very important. How is Irish whiskey going to evolve over time? And I think each distillery is going to carve out their own identity. That's going to be true of Slane as well. And as long as we keep innovating and we keep producing good quality whiskey and variety, I think consumers around the world are going to enjoy exploring Irish. I mean, you have to remember that 10, 15 years ago in the US, you'd be lucky if you found an Irish whiskey section in a good liquor store. Now you go in and thankfully, we've got our own space, and it's been lovely seeing that develop over time. So, choice is important. I'm a big fan of choice, and people are enjoying moving not only between brands, but between categories. And that's a good thing. I think it's people drinking the same thing day in, day out, which maybe was the way, 20 years ago. Now people are changing because they're driven by choice and I guess the quest for flavor. And when it comes to Slane, that's what we wanted to deliver on, was flavor.
How many markets are you guys in now?
So we are now in, obviously, the home market here in Ireland, with your good selves in the US, which is the number one market in the world for Irish whiskey by a long shot. We're also in France. We're in the UK. We are in Romania. And then if we fly all over to the other side of the world, we are in Australia and New Zealand, and then global travel retail as well on a limited basis. So, we're still relatively quite focused about where we sell Slane. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure, we're building for the long term. So if we do go into a new market, we want to make sure we can give it the attention it deserves, and the support and education and everything else to get it up and running.
You'll find my tasting notes for Slane Irish Whiskey at whiskycast.com. And thanks to Alex Conyngham for joining us this week on WhiskyCast In Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret, hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies. Comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I mentioned Distell's batch of 2020 special releases during the news. Had the chance to taste a couple of them on that call the other day with Julianne Fernandez, along with Bunnahabhain Distillery Manager Andrew Brown and Visitors Center Manager Billy Sinclair. Let's start off with the Bunnahabhain 2008 Manzanilla Sherry Cask Matured Single Malt. It's bottled at 52.3% ABV. The nose has notes of Christmas cake with a good fruity character, along with a touch of oak, fresh berries, and salted caramel. The taste has just a hint of brine, along with salted caramel, baking spices, honey, and hints of dried fruits and oak. The finish, long and dry with a slight nuttiness, and touches of oak, spices, and fresh berries. I'm scoring the Bunnahabhain 2008 Manzanilla Sherry Cask Matured Single Malt a 94. I mentioned the Deanston 2002 Pinot Noir finish during the news. It spent the first 16 years in refill casks before the final 2 years were spent in those Pinot Noir casks, and it's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose is fruity and malty with green apples, vanilla, and dried flowers. The taste is creamy and rich with a good fruitiness and excellent complexity with apples, peaches, touches of dark fruits, and barley sugar. The finish, long, complex, and well-balanced. I'm giving the Deanston 2002 Pinot Noir finish a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. which will be releasing the next batch of Penny's Proof later this year. It's a preview of Sagamore Spirit whiskey, distilled on site in Baltimore, and last year's first release of samples sold out in hours. The only way to find out when and how to get your hands on this year's batch is to join Sagamore Spirit's Whiskey Thieves. Sign up today at sagamorespirit.com. We'll get the annual release of the Old Forester Birthday Bourbon next week, but I received a sample this week. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, this year's release comes from 95 barrels that were all filled on June 5th, 2010, and it's bottled at 49% ABV. The nose has a nice sweetness with caramel candy and brown sugar notes, along with toasted oak, soft spices, and touches of molasses and apricots. The taste starts off with oak tannins, complementing caramel candy, hints of spice, molasses, and dried fruits. Adding some water opens up the fruity notes and spices, while the finish is long and complex with a good balance of oak, spices, and caramel. I'm scoring the Old Forester 2020 Birthday Bourbon a 94. Finally, I mentioned the limited edition Maker's Mark 46 cask strength release a couple of weeks ago. I received a sample of it this week. The nose has honey and brown sugar sweetness, with a hint of leather, tree fruits, sandalwood, and a slightly herbal touch. The taste is spicy with black pepper, allspice, and a hint of cinnamon, complemented by honey, brown sugar, black cherries, and a hint of pipe tobacco. The finish, long and spicy, with a subtle touch of fruit. I'm scoring the Maker's Mark 46 cask strength a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,900 different whiskeys from around the world. You'll find it at whiskycast.com. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Had an interesting question on Twitter the other day from @itinerante Kata. Is smooth a good word to describe whiskey? Well, smooth is one of those words that some people like and others don't. I'm not a big fan of it because it really isn't a precise descriptor. There's no real way to compare one person's description of smooth to another person's. It's totally subjective, and it's a descriptor that I try to use sparingly. Had several comments on last week's podcast and my interview with Johnny Walker Master Blender Jim Beveridge, including high praise from one of his colleagues. Alan Winchester of the Glenlivet posted this on LinkedIn. Great insight from a master. Thank you, Alan. It takes one to know one. Ottawa's Scotsman posted this on Instagram after Jim's comments about planning for the future. Whiskey is our tie to the past, and we have to do what we can for our future. If we don't do what we can today, what will whiskey look like in 200 years from now? I mentioned the photos that Mark Williams at Live Paint on Twitter and Instagram sent recently of the whiskey barrels he's turned into planters, including one that I mentioned looked a lot like a Jack Daniel's Sinatra Select barrel because of the grooves cut into the inside. Well, we have confirmation of that now from the person who would know best. Jack Daniel's master distiller Jeff Arnett saw the photo on Instagram and responded, "I can assure you it is definitely a Jack Daniel's Sinatra Select barrel." Thanks for the confirmation, Jeff. Mark also wondered this week why those barrels were turned into planters instead of being sent over to Scotland to put Scotch whiskey into. I don't have the specific answer for that, but I suspect the grooves that were cut into the insides of those barrels might not fly with the traditional practice requirements in the Scotch whiskey regulations. That is just a guess, though. If you have a question, suggestion, or even just some idle speculation of your own, you can always find us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that all make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. This one really isn't quite whiskey specific, but researchers have found that your smartphone might be able to tell if you've had too much to drink. And that is not by testing your breath on those late-night phone calls to your exes, or by screening the stuff you post on social media at night. University of Pittsburgh researchers have found that the technology in smartphones can measure your changes in walking patterns. Test subjects had smartphones attached to their lower backs and were then measured walking over a 7-hour period after drinking enough alcohol to reach a .20 blood alcohol level. Keep in mind, .08 is the legal limit in most U.S. states, and it's even lower in other countries, meaning these test subjects were pretty well hammered. The researchers found that the same accelerometers that record when you shake a phone to undo a mistake, for instance, or measure your hand movements during a game, are about 90% accurate in predicting whether someone's had too much to drink. Now, don't expect an app for this anytime soon. The research is still in the early stages, and since most of us do not carry our phones on our lower backs, it's not clear whether the measurements are just as accurate when a phone is carried in a pocket, for instance. No matter what, just don't drink and drive. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, our whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of all of our past episodes since 2005. We'd love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. My email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast.
WhiskeyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020. And comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.